What if you never had to replant your garden again? Imagine planting once and harvesting for 30 years. No annual seeds, no tilling, no fertilizer bags stacked in your garage every spring. Just food growing itself year after year in the same space. Every April, millions of Americans spend thousands on garden supplies. Seed packets pile up, fertilizer bags stack high. Garden centers overflow with desperate weekend warriors buying solutions to problems that should not exist. Then September arrives, half the crops failed, the soil looks worse than March, and next year, start over, buy again, replant everything. Medieval monasteries built a different system. They called it the forest garden. Plant once, layer 7 types of food plants at different heights, mimicking natural forests, then step back. The garden feeds itself, it protects itself, it fertilizes itself for decades, sometimes centuries. This was not theory, this was survival technology, field-tested across 800 years. From monastery gardens in Spain to manor estates in England, these food forests sustained entire communities without a single chemical input, without replanting seasons, without the dependency cycle modern agriculture requires. Then industrial farming happened. By 1950, the forest garden vanished from American memory, not because it failed, because it made gardeners too independent. A food forest producing for 30 years means 30 years you are not buying seeds annually, not purchasing fertilizer seasonally, not dependent on corporations quarterly. Today, we are going to rebuild that system. 7 layers, 7 principles, 1 planting, decades of abundance. Before we begin, drop a comment. Do you replant your entire garden every year, or are you ready for something permanent? Let's dig in. Layer 1, the canopy, fruit and nut trees that outlive you. The top layer of a medieval food forest reached 20 to 40 feet high. This was the canopy. Mature fruit and nut trees planted not in rows like modern orchards, but scattered naturally like forest trees. Apple, pear, plum, cherry, walnut, chestnut. These were not ornamental. These were food infrastructure. A single apple tree planted in year 1 produces nothing year 2, light harvest year 3. By year 5, the tree hits stride, producing 100 to 200 pounds of apples per season. Then it continues for 50 years. Some varieties produce for 80 years or longer. Do the math. One tree at 150 pounds per year for 50 years equals 7,500 pounds of apples from one planting event. No replanting, no reseeding, just annual harvest from a permanent structure. Compare that to tomatoes. You replant every single year for equivalent production. That is 50 consecutive plantings to match what one apple tree does automatically. Medieval monasteries documented this in orchard records. The Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds in England maintained apple trees planted in 1120 that were still producing in 1540. That is 420 years, not decades, centuries. But medieval food forests did not just plant fruit trees, they planted the entire vertical space beneath them. Modern orchards leave ground bare. Herbicides kill everything except the tree, wasted space. Medieval forests used that space, 7 layers stacked vertically, each producing food, each supporting the others. The canopy provided 3 critical functions beyond fruit. First, shade. The dappled light filtering through leaves created microclimates below. Plants that struggled in full sun thrived in partial shade. Second, wind protection. Tall trees blocked harsh winds that damaged delicate crops. Third, nutrient pumping. Tree roots extend 20 to 30 feet deep, pulling minerals from subsoil that shallow-rooted plants cannot reach. When leaves fall and decompose, those deep nutrients return to topsoil, feeding everything else. Modern agriculture replaced this with monoculture orchards, trees in perfect rows, ground kept bare, sprayed with chemicals to prevent competition. The system produces high yields short-term, then depletes soil long-term. Medieval food forests produced moderate yields indefinitely. Layer 2. The understory, dwarf trees and large shrubs. Hazelnut bushes, elderberry, quince, medlar. These plants reached 10 to 15 feet tall, filling the space between ground and canopy. Hazelnuts were particularly valuable. One bush planted in year 1 begins producing year 3. By year 5, it yields 10 to 25 pounds of nuts per season. Those nuts store for months, high in protein and healthy fats. A family with 5 hazelnut bushes had permanent nut production. No replanting, just annual harvest. Elderberries served dual purpose. The berries harvested in late summer made medicine. Medieval herbalists used elderberry syrup for colds and respiratory illness. Modern science confirms this. Elderberry contains compounds that inhibit viral replication. What medieval monks knew through observation, we now prove in laboratories. But the genius of Layer 2 was timing. Canopy trees produced fruit in summer and autumn. Understory shrubs produced earlier or later, extending harvest season. Elderberries ripened in August, hazelnuts matured in September, quinces lasted until October. Stagger the layers and you stagger the harvest. Food arriving continuously from spring through late autumn instead of all at once. Medieval manuscripts describe this explicitly. The Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino documented planting schedules designed to spread harvest across maximum time. Early cherries in June, apples in August, pears in September, quinces in October, walnuts in November. One garden feeding communities for 6 months continuously. Modern gardens concentrate harvest. Tomatoes all ripen in July. Zucchini overwhelms in August. Then nothing. We created feast or famine. Medieval food forests created steady supply. Layer 3. The shrub layer. Currants, gooseberries, and perennial berries. Layer 3 dropped to 3 to 6 feet high. This was shrub territory. Currants, gooseberries, jostaberries, perennial berry bushes that produced year after year with 0 replanting. Currants were medieval staples, red, black, and white varieties planted densely. One mature bush produced 6 to 10 pounds of berries per season. Plant 10 bushes and you had 60 to 100 pounds of fruit annually from plants that lived 15 to 20 years. The berries were preserved multiple ways: fresh eating, dried like raisins, fermented into wine, cooked into preserves. Medieval kitchens processed currants in bulk because the bushes produced abundantly and reliably every single year. Gooseberries filled similar roles. Tart berries harvested green for cooking or left to ripen for fresh eating. The bushes tolerated shade, meaning they thrived beneath taller fruit trees. You could pack them densely in spaces where nothing else grew. But shrubs provided more than food. They created habitat. Birds nested in dense branches. Those birds ate insects that would otherwise damage crops. Medieval gardeners understood this. They encouraged birds by providing nesting sites. The birds paid rent in pest control. Modern gardening fights insects with chemicals, spray pesticides, kill everything, then wonder why pollinator populations collapse. Medieval food forests used biology, create habitat for beneficial insects and birds, let them handle pests. The system balanced itself. Compare maintenance requirements. Modern berry gardens plant annuals like strawberries. Every few years you replant. You fight weeds. You fertilize constantly. Medieval currant and gooseberry bushes? Plant once, mulch around the base, prune lightly every few years. That is it. Decades of production with minimal intervention. This is where I want to mention something useful.
If you are serious about building food independence, I have put together some trusted resources in the description below. There are guides on growing and preserving your own food, along with books on natural remedies and traditional wellness practices. These are tools that align with the self-sufficient approach we are talking about. Check the description if you want to dig deeper. Layer 4, the herbaceous layer, perennial vegetables that never die. Layer 4 brought us to ground level. This was the herbaceous layer, perennial vegetables and herbs that died back in winter, then regrew every spring. No replanting, ever. Medieval gardens featured plants modern Americans have forgotten. Good King Henry, a perennial spinach that produced greens for 20 years from one planting. Wovage, a celery-flavored herb so potent, one leaf seasoned soup for 50 people. The plant lived decades. Sea kale, a coastal perennial with edible shoots, stems, and leaves. Plant once, harvest forever.
But the most important herbaceous plants were medicinal herbs. Comfrey, yarrow, feverfew, lemon balm. These filled the spaces between shrubs and trees. Medieval monks cultivated them not just for medicine, but for soil improvement. Comfrey roots penetrated 10 feet deep. Those roots pulled nutrients from subsoil. When you cut comfrey leaves and let them decompose around other plants, you were transferring deep nutrients to the surface, free fertilizer. Medieval gardeners called this technique dynamic accumulation. Modern permaculture rediscovered it and gave it the same name. Yarrow attracted beneficial insects. Feverfew repelled aphids. Lemon balm deterred mosquitoes. Each plant served multiple functions: food and medicine, and pest control, and fertilizer, all from the same perennial planting. This is the core principle of food forests: stacking functions. Every plant does multiple jobs. Modern gardens separate functions: vegetables here, flowers there, herbs in a different bed. Medieval food forests integrated everything: efficiency through diversity. Modern science now proves this approach superior. Polyculture systems produce 30 to 50% more food per acre than monocultures while using fewer inputs. We are rediscovering through research what medieval gardeners knew through practice. Layer 5, the ground cover layer, edible carpets. Layer 5 covered bare soil. This was ground cover, low-growing plants spreading horizontally, wild strawberries, creeping thyme, chamomile, violets. These plants formed living carpets beneath taller layers. Wild strawberries were particularly valuable. Unlike modern strawberries requiring annual replanting, wild strawberries spread through runners, forming dense mats. Once established, they produced small, intensely flavored berries every year indefinitely. The berries were smaller than modern varieties, but the flavor was concentrated. Medieval accounts described them as tasting like concentrated sunshine. Creeping thyme served triple duty: edible herb for cooking, ground cover preventing weeds, pollinator attractor. The flowers bloomed for months, attracting bees that pollinated fruit trees and berry bushes. Plant thyme once and it spread slowly, covering ground for decades. But the most important function of ground cover was soil protection. Medieval gardeners understood that bare soil was damaged soil. Rain eroded it, sun baked it, weeds invaded it. Living ground cover prevented all three problems. Plant roots held soil in place, leaves shaded the surface, keeping it moist and cool, dense growth blocked weed seeds from germinating. Modern agriculture uses herbicides or plastic mulch to suppress weeds. Both methods require annual reapplication, both cost money, both create waste. Medieval ground covers suppressed weeds permanently while producing food and supporting pollinators. One solution, multiple problems solved.
Archaeological evidence from medieval food forest sites shows soil organic matter levels significantly higher than surrounding agricultural fields. The ground covers decomposing leaves and roots, continuously built soil. Modern agriculture depletes soil. Medieval food forests built it. Layer 6, the Rhizosphere layer. Root crops you plant once. Layer 6 was underground. This was the Rhizosphere, perennial root crops that stayed in the ground year-round. You harvested what you needed, the rest kept growing. Skirret was the medieval favorite, a perennial root vegetable producing sweet white roots similar to parsnips. Plant once, harvest for decades. One medieval account described skirret beds at royal estates producing continuously for 40 years. Modern gardeners have never heard of it. Jerusalem artichokes filled similar roles, tubers forming underground that you could dig as needed. What you did not harvest regrew next year, effectively infinite food from one planting. The tubers stored in ground better than any root cellar. Dig them fresh whenever you needed them, even in winter. Horseradish was the indestructible root. Plant one piece, it spread aggressively, forever. Medieval texts warned gardeners to contain horseradish, or it would take over entire gardens. That aggressive growth meant permanent pungent roots for medicine and flavor. No replanting, ever. The Rhizosphere layer provided food security. If everything else failed, the root crops remained. You could not see them, but they were there, underground, waiting. This was insurance. Drought killed annual vegetables. Root crops survived. Late frost destroyed spring greens. Roots waited below, unharmed. Medieval farming faced constant uncertainty, weather, war, plague. Food forests with deep rhizosphere layers provided resilience. No matter what happened above ground, something remained below to sustain the community.
Modern gardens put all their eggs in annual baskets. Everything depends on one growing season going perfectly. One bad year means no food. Medieval food forests distributed risk across multiple layers. Some would always produce regardless of conditions. Layer 7, the vertical layer. Climbing plants using vertical space. Layer 7 went vertical. This was climbing plants. Vines growing up trees and shrubs using vertical space that would otherwise be empty. Grapes, hops, climbing beans, hardy kiwi, each turning empty air into food production. Grapes were the medieval vertical crop. Vines planted at the base of fruit trees climbed into branches. The trees provided support, the grapes provided fruit. Both plants benefited. The grape leaves shaded tree roots, keeping them cool. The tree structure supported grape growth without requiring separate trellises. This technique was documented extensively. Medieval vineyard managers described intentional planting of grapes with scattered fruit trees. The practice persisted into the 1800s before industrial agriculture separated crops into monocultures. We called this technique fruticulture, growing multiple crops in the same space simultaneously. Hops climbed vigorously, reaching 20 feet in a single season. Medieval brewers cultivated them in food forests. The hop cones, harvested in autumn, flavored beer. The vines died back in winter, then regrew rapidly each spring, permanent beer ingredient from perennial planting. But the vertical layer also supported nitrogen fixation. Climbing beans planted at tree bases fixed atmospheric nitrogen through root nodules. That nitrogen fertilized the tree and every other plant nearby. Free fertilizer delivered automatically every growing season. Plant beans once as perennials and you created permanent fertility. Modern agriculture separates crops. Grapes in vineyards, apples in orchards, beans in fields, each monoculture requiring separate land. Medieval food forests stacked everything vertically, the same acre producing fruit, plus grapes, plus beans, plus hops, plus herbs, plus berries, plus roots. 7 layers, 7 food sources, 1 piece of land. The integration principle, how 7 layers become one forest. The genius of medieval food forests was not the individual plants, it was the integration, how 7 layers supported each other, creating a system greater than the sum of parts. Tall trees dropped leaves. Those leaves fed ground covers and soil organisms. Shrubs provided bird habitat. Birds controlled pests. Herbs attracted pollinators. Pollinators fertilized fruit trees. Nitrogen-fixing plants fed heavy feeders. Deep-rooted plants brought up minerals. Everything connected. Everything contributed. Medieval gardeners spent years observing these relationships. They did not understand biochemistry or ecology as sciences, but they understood what worked. They saw that gardens with diversity thrived. Gardens with monocultures struggled, so they built diversity intentionally. Modern agriculture fights nature. Monocultures, chemicals, constant intervention. Medieval food forests worked with nature. Diversity, integration, minimal intervention. The difference between control and cooperation. The University of Michigan studied food forest systems. They found mature food forests required 90% less maintenance than annual vegetable gardens while producing equivalent calories per acre. 90% less work, same food output. That is not nostalgia, that is measurable efficiency. Why it disappeared? The industrial trap. Food forests fed Europe for 800 years. Then, in 50 years, they vanished. Not because they failed, because they threatened profit. Industrial agriculture needed dependency. Farmers buying seeds annually, purchasing fertilizers seasonally, renting equipment. The entire system was built on recurring revenue. Food forests broke that model. A family with a mature food forest bought almost nothing. No seeds, no fertilizer, minimal tools. They were independent, self-sufficient. Corporations could not profit from their food production. That was unacceptable. Agricultural colleges established in the late 1800s taught annual row cropping, not food forests. Chemical companies funded research on synthetic fertilizers, not perennial systems. Government subsidies supported grain monocultures, not diverse food forests. By 1950, knowledge of food forests survived only in scattered European monastery gardens and old estate properties. America had erased the practice entirely. We had replaced 800 years of proven sustainability with systems designed for quarterly profits. But the consequences are measurable. The USDA estimates American topsoil has lost 50% of its original organic matter. Modern agriculture depletes soil at rates 10 to 100 times faster than natural regeneration. Medieval food forests built soil continuously for centuries. We traded permanent abundance for temporary extraction, independence for dependency, wisdom for marketing. What you can build. You do not need 40 acres to build a food forest. You need 1,000 square feet, a typical suburban backyard. Enough space for 2 fruit trees, 3 shrub layer berries, ground covers beneath, and vertical crops climbing the fence. That small space, planted following 7-layer principles, could produce several hundred pounds of food annually once mature, for 30 years or more. No replanting, minimal maintenance, just harvest. Medieval food forests took time to establish, 3 years before significant production, 5 years to reach full stride. But once established, they ran on momentum. The investment was front-loaded. The returns lasted decades. Compare that to annual gardens. Equal investment every single year. Same planting, same maintenance, same inputs. Treadmill gardening. You stop and everything stops. Food forests were investments. Plant once, benefit for a lifetime. Potentially benefit your children and grandchildren. Modern gardens are expenses. Annual costs producing annual harvests with nothing permanent remaining. The question is not whether food forests work. They worked for 800 years across every climate in Europe. The question is whether you want independence or dependency, permanent abundance or annual expense, systems that feed you or systems you feed with money every spring. Medieval monks chose independence. They planted food forests and fed communities for generations. Modern agriculture chose dependency. We plant annuals and feed corporations quarterly. What will you choose? If you found this valuable, drop a comment below. What is the first layer you will plant? and check the description for resources on building real food independence. The knowledge was here all along. Let's bring it back.